behalf of the Crown, signed 7 treaties with First Nations leaders in what is now called Manitoba. This land is the homeland of the Métis Nation and the traditional territory of the Nehiyaw, Dakota, Dene, Anishinaabe, Anisinaabeg, and Ojibwe nations, all of whom have and had a spiritual relationship with this land since time immemorial before the signing of treaties. The MBA represents approximately 1,600 members throughout our province. Our membership includes students, faculty members, lawyers, and judges from a variety of backgrounds who gather in lands and territories sharing the rights and obligations of these 7 treaties. We are pleased to welcome participants from the different territories across Canada. We ask each of you to consider the lands and territories on which you practice, as we acknowledge with respect and gratitude the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked this land for centuries. We hope each of you will take concrete steps to gain an understanding of the customary laws of Indigenous peoples in relation to these sacred lands they have lived on since the beginning of time. We also wish to acknowledge that the water we enjoy in Winnipeg comes from Shoal Lake, the lands of the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3. Welcome to our session on Making Rights Real, a vision for providing accessible legal services, part of this year's A2J Week 2025. I'm Janell Jackson, the co-chair of the MBA's Equality section, and I'm honored to be moderating today's discussion. We know that access to legal services requires breaking down barriers, ensuring equity, and making the legal system work for everyone. The theme of this week, 10 years forward, expanding justice, embracing inclusion, reminds us that while progress has been made, there's still so much to do. Over the next 90 minutes, our distinguished panelists will draw on real-world experience and accessibility insight to explore how legal practitioners can design and deliver services in ways that are inclusive, responsive, and practical. We'll talk about tangible steps. So whether you're working at a firm, in government, a community organization, or policy role, I hope you'll find ideas you can use immediately. We encourage you to engage, ask questions, reflect on your own work, and consider how you might shift practice or policy in your space. We will make sure to leave time to answer these questions at the end of the session. Today is about opening doors and lifting voices. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce today's panelists. Darren Davis, Director, Legal Services Branch. In January 2024, Darren was appointed into the role of the Director of the Legal Services Branch at Manitoba Justice. In the community, Darren is a passionate volunteer for Breakthrough T1D and its efforts to raise funds for a cure for diabetes and advocacy to improve awareness and the lives of people living with type 1 diabetes. But most importantly, Darren is the proud father of 3 smart, strong, and beautiful young women, and an ongoing labor of love for his smarter, stronger, and more beautiful wife. Next, we have Laurel Harris. Laurel A. Harris, KC, currently serves as the director of the Internationally Trained Lawyer Program, Equity and Transformation at Robson Hall. Ms. Harris founded Equitable Solutions Consulting in 2020, leveraging her legal expertise and extensive experience engaging in anti-racism and equity work to work with organizations within and outside of the legal community. A geeky introvert, Laurel spends her spare time planning new travels, reading urban fantasy, and dreaming of the Oxford comma. Dr. Tess Sheldon, Associate Professor, University of Windsor Faculty of Law. Dr. Tess Sheldon joined the University of Windsor Faculty of Law in 2018. She writes, presents, and teaches extensively on a variety of mental health, access to justice, disability, and human rights topics. She explores the law's possibilities and perils to confront the regimes that reflect and reinforce economic and social exclusion of persons with disabilities and consumers, survivors of the psychiatric system. Dawn Staliga, law student, University of Manitoba. Dawn is a part-time student at Robson Hall. Prior to law school, she worked for the Manitoba Accessibility Compliance Secretariat. During her time at the Secretariat, she discovered her passion for helping individuals like herself who face barriers to disability. She now utilizes her expertise as an individual collaborator for the Canadian Accessibility Network. Next, we have Peter Tong, who brings a broad range of experience to his work. Drawing on his legal career and day-to-day experience as a wheelchair user, Peter founded Peter Tong Consulting in 2021. In the community, he is a board member of the Cerebral Palsy Association of Manitoba and SCE LifeWorks. A proud member of Rotary International, Peter also contributes to numerous humanitarian projects, both locally and internationally. You can find more information on their bios on our website. This session is being recorded and will be made available on www.manitobaaccesstojustice.ca next month. The session also has closed captioning and simultaneous ASL translation. Okay, starting off with our first question. In order to ground today's conversation on disability and accessibility, let's start with thinking about the scope of disability. Dawn, I'm going to turn this over to you. Can you comment on that, please?
Okay, well, I think a really good place and a definition I really like about the scope of disability is from the Accessible Canada Act and their section 2. Just going to read it for you guys. Disability means any impairment, including a physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory impairment, or functional limitation, whether permanent, temporary, or episodic in nature, or evident or not, that in interaction with a barrier hinders a person's full and equal participation in society. Seems very complicated, but it's a very wide definition. That's why I like it. So basically what it says, if there's something preventing somebody interacting like what we consider normally with others, it's considered a disability, right? Even though we might not see it or we might not understand it, you know, it's a very wide scope, right? It gives that temporal, right? You know, some people throughout their life may be disabled, but it's not continuous, right? It may be situational depending on what they're going through. You know, you kind of think about it, if somebody broke their leg, you know, it's generally a pretty temporary disability, you know, but that's very visible. But, you know, if somebody's struggling with mental health issue, you know, you may not see that, and it may be episodic, may come and go. They may have better days, they may have, you know, worse days. So this is why I like it, because it's a very open, you know, scope, right? And I come from this from two perspectives. First, as a person who has had to engage legal systems. I went through a divorce, and I went to my lawyer and I asked for them to give me a summary, put what they were telling me in writing, right? Because I have ADHD, and when something's personal to me, I get really emotional and I'm not going to remember what they're saying, right? You know, it's a situational dependent. Any other situation, pretty good memory. But when, you know, my emotions are involved, not great. And basically, I don't think there was any, you know, fault of the, you know, the lawyer. They just didn't have a comprehension. They're like, no, we will not do that. We are not required. And I'm like, as part of like it, they don't necessarily see it as a disability. They're just being, you're over dramatic. You know, this is intense for everybody. I'm like, yes, it's intense for everybody. You know, anybody in this emotional situation under this, you know, definition would be considered disabled, right? If it's in hindering their ability to interact or communicate, it would be considered a disability, right? And the other scope is because I do have ADHD. I've gone, I've talked with other lawyers, and I've had the thing is, oh, so you're not really disabled. You're a super lawyer. You can do more because you have ADHD. It's not really a disability. And I'm like, just because you don't see how it works or affects my life, doesn't mean it's not. So when we're thinking scope, it can be as little as, what, some days somebody's a little more tired or fatigued, right? So they need to take extra breaks, right? Or it could be as extreme, as like this person needs to be aware of like when they eat, right? If they have blood sugar issues, right? Really affecting the flow of their day, right? So anywhere along that continuum, if it affects their ability to communicate and interact in society, it's considered a barrier. Doesn't matter how small it is, doesn't matter how big it is. It doesn't matter whether you can see it. Just because you don't see it, you can't be like, oh, that's not really happening, because you don't know what's going on within a person, right? So yeah, that's really why like the scope is wide, it's broad. You don't need a piece of paper. There's no, I need from a medical professional to tell me that you're facing a barrier, right? Documentation is not necessarily part of the requirement, right? And then based on the scope, you got to figure out where you go next. So
Right. Thank you for that, Dawn. Yeah, no, Peter, I'll call on you if that's okay to give your comment on this as well.
I agree. I think that's a great definition because it does encompass disabilities in all of its forms, whether it's permanent or temporary, and all of that. And it also, we're going to talk a little bit later about the models of disability, and this very much ties into what I'll be talking about around the issues of barriers. So I think as we go along, you'll see it all come together.
Great. Yeah. Laurel, did you want to touch on the scope of disability, please?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with Dawn's statements, and that's actually the definition of disability that I also use when I'm trying to explain the scope of disability. But I don't think we can talk about disability without talking about barrier. So the scope of barriers is also really important to frame this discussion, because the disability is only a disability when it encounters a barrier that prevents you from doing something, right? Or being some way or whatever. And so the definition of barrier in the Accessible Canada Act means anything, including anything physical, architectural, technological, or attitudinal. Anything that is based on information or communications, or anything that is the result of a policy or a practice that hinders the full and equal participation in society of persons with an impairment, including a physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory impairment or functional limitation. So when we talk about the scope of disability, we also have to talk about framing what disability is. And when we get into the social model of disability, we're going to talk about that a bit. But I think that we need to sort of broaden, when we talk about the broadness of the scope of disability, when we think about disability, we have to think broadly in terms of what those impairments might be, but we also have to think very broadly in terms of what the barriers might be, especially the attitudinal ones and the cultural ones, which are the ones that really impact, as Dawn's just said, the way that you actually move through the world from a practical standpoint.
Wow, Laurel, thank you so much for that comment. That was strongly received on my end. Darren, can I call on you, please, to ground us on the scope of disability?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Janelle. What I really like the focus. I agree with Laurel that the disability it's not a thing until actually hit the barrier. That totally makes sense. In my experience as managing people for the better part of 2 decades, in fact, probably more than 2 decades now. I started when I was a wee child, as you can tell. One of the things that I have found to be really useful is to try to think about it not so much as a disability, but rather about enabling people. And so you have to be aware of the disability. Obviously, people come to you, hopefully they come to you. You've accomplished something if they actually come to you and tell you that they're having an issue. and then focus on how do you help them with that, right? We all have through various points of our lives, everybody has had a moment when they weren't at their best. And if you think of that, bring that perspective to our accommodation and our working with people with diabetes, with disabilities or other protected characteristics, right? It's not always a disability. It can be something else. So how do we help them continue to do their best despite what's going on for them? I think Dawn made a really good point about these things can be temporary. Broken leg example is a great one. There's so many others, but they may not be. And we definitely need to be open to working to help people do their best. That's the objective, I think.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Tesh Sheldon, can I please call on you for comment as well, just in terms of grounding us on the scope of disability?
Yeah, for sure. Echoing everyone's comments so far that there's such good reason to challenge medicalized understandings of disability, that disability isn't about what's wrong with an individual, but instead, it's about the interaction between people and barriers, social, environmental, attitudinal barriers. And one thing just I would love to add is that, under human rights and accessibility frameworks, the definition of disability is explicitly very broad, but we know that the protection covers perceived disabilities. And we know this from a case at the SCC Supreme Court called Mercier. So perceived disability is protected. That the protection recognizes that discrimination occurs not because of actual impairment, but because of perceptions or stigma or assumptions. So perceived disabilities, it refers to a situation where a person is treated as disabled, even if they don't identify as such or don't have a formal diagnosis. Human rights protections extend to people believed to have a disability. And I think that's, jives with what we've all said about how stigma and perception really produce disability.
Wow. That is a very, very strong comment, just highlighting the importance of today's conversation. Thank you so much for that. So just now that we've got commentary from everybody on the scope of disability, which is truly informative, so thank you to you all for your comments. That'll just take me to my next question on, and Peter, if you don't mind, I'm going to put this question to you and then we'll trickle off and incorporate everybody else afterwards. But what is the social model of disability and how does it apply with the legal profession and the practice of law?
So I'll start by saying there are three major models of disability, and I'm only going to touch on two because we mentioned two already in our discussion. And one is the medical model, and I'm going to sound very dismissive of this because I kind of am. And that is the medical model says, well, the way that we deal with disability is we fix the broken people and then we don't have to worry about disability anymore. In contrast, the social model says that disability is a function of the way that society is organized rather than the person's impairment or difference. So the disability, as we've already mentioned, happens when you come up against a gap, something that's missing that you need, or a barrier, an obstacle that's in your way because society doesn't expect you to be there with your disability. So then that sort of raises the question, and it sort of puts the burden on everyone in society to become more open to begin by identifying gaps and barriers to access, and then coming up with planned, organized, and funded processes for dealing with them, really.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. Laurel, could you pick up on that, please? If would you like me to repeat the question, or no? Thank you.
Only very briefly. One of the things that I think we also should consider, because I'm really into turning things on their heads and looking at them different ways. One of the things I think we should really consider around the social model of disability, as opposed to this medical model where we're trying to fix the quote unquote problem, right? And if we can't fix the problem, then we find some kind of accommodation that will fix the problem, at least for us and our discomfort, right? But for the social model of disability, what I really think is that we need to talk about society, not just society, but individuals externally. Like we really need to talk about, when we're talking about a social model of disability, about what that means for other people and how they interact around folks with disabilities. I would say that I think a lot of the ableism is grounded in that medical model completely, right? And so, and that's what we carry with us culturally. So when we talk about attitudinal barriers, one of them is clinging to the medical model of disability, and culturally clinging to the medical model of disability, which doesn't really serve anybody.
Thank you so much for that, Laurel. Dawn, can I look to you for a response, please?
Well, I just want to pick up on Peter's notion of identifying gaps, creating barriers to, access, right? It's really hard to do that because what might be a barrier for me might not be a barrier for you, right? So identifying them can take a while, but it's also, they can be small or large, right? For me, it took me a while to figure out, for me going to law school, the lights give me a really big headache, right? So it's a barrier for me to focus. So I actually went and got sunglasses.
That's why you wear the sunglasses.
Yes, it's not just because I'm trying to be cool in class.
I always thought you were cool.
So gaps can be as little as that, right? So we're not necessarily talking huge gaps where you can't get into a building, right? So there, once again, it's along a spectrum of what might be that gap or creating that barrier for somebody, right? And these barriers are generally pretty unique, just like how a disability impacts an individual.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Dawn. I really appreciate that example you've given. I'm also a law student with Dawn, and of course it makes me curious. I really, there's an artist out there, her name is Her, and she wears sunglasses when she performs. She's one of my favorites. So I always just thought that was a very cool style, but thank you for sharing that personal example of your own and having that vulnerability with us on this panel today, Dawn. I really appreciate you. Moving on to Darren. Darren, can you please comment on what is the social model of disability and how does it apply with the legal profession and the practice of law? Okay, Dr. Tess.
No, sorry, I'm muted. I'm ready. I was starting being beautifully sensible and then forgot.
Okay, apologies.
Sorry about that, Janelle. No, it's on
That's
me.
okay.
I was just going to say, one of the things that struck me as we were listening to, as I was listening to my colleagues' comments, is the idea of inclusion, which I think really is, when I started, we talked about adaptation. So somebody needed something and you changed the workplace for them, whether it's, say, somebody in a wheelchair. So you made the doors wider, you tried to get stuff out of the hallways. As opposed to now, which I think the objective, is inclusion. So you design the space in advance. You know that someone might need to come in one day in a wheelchair. So you make sure the hallways are big enough, make sure the doorways are big enough. Sometimes those are complicated things. It's taking out the stairs that are on the way into the buildings and putting in the ramp. And that's, it's not easy for government to do, but it's easy for government to say everybody has to do it. So sometimes these things can be really expensive, obviously. But the idea, that's why we see ramps everywhere, right? Because we're moving towards inclusion so that the space is ready to receive the person rather than the person being ready to access the space. And you won't get everything, obviously, as we've talked about, a broad definition both temporary disabilities but we have but we're making progress. And ultimately, if you are more open to more inclusive, you're going to hear more things that you can do. You're going to make people who need some assistance more likely to raise it, because one of the things that happens with invisible disabilities, as we've heard a bit from Dawn about the sunglasses and ADHD, you just don't talk about it. You notice the glasses, but you didn't know why, right? And Dawn
Exactly.
around saying, "Hey, I've got this. This is going on in my life," understandably.
Exactly.
But there are so many more invisible disabilities that we hear about and have to confront today, or maybe I should say get to confront. Not to use negative language about it. It's a great opportunity for us to make sure that everybody does get to participate.
Yeah, I truly feel like I'm learning in real time here. You can't make this up. And I think that is a great synopsis of what we're all confronting as we move forward after this panel. So thank you so much for that comment. Dr. Tess, can you expand on that for us, please? Thank you.
I would say briefly that this all makes such good sense, right? That this idea that disability is not like located in the individual body or mind, right? But instead it's about the systems or environment or attitudes that fail to understand, universal human diversity, right? And so by framing disability broadly, including perceived, episodic, invisible forms of disability, it makes sense that disability is socially produced, not individually contained. And that shift was and is so foundational to disabled people's movements, the MAD movement, right? The idea that law has to confront the really complex ways that disabled people experience discrimination. So disability as experienced differently, or barriers experienced differently across gender, race, class, cultural contexts. Otherwise, we risk like a mechanical approach to understanding disability discrimination by forcing a person to fit into a single group and caricaturize their experience. And I'm thinking about the lived experience of discrimination by disabled women, Indigenous people with disabilities, young people with disabilities. I'm thinking about great work around anti-Black Satanism. That racialized persons with mental health issues experience unique forms of stereotyping.
Yes. Most people know I have 2 children of my own, and they're currently going through their own mental health challenges. So everything you guys are speaking to definitely affects me personally, as I'm sure it does the viewers, the audience. So this is great to go into our third question. And Laurel, I'll just direct this question to you. How does the ableist structure of the legal profession and of law school create a downstream impact on how we serve our clients, and more specifically our disabled clients?
So let's start with the outcomes, and then let's go back. The outcome of being ableist in law school and being ableist as a profession is that we don't serve disabled clients with disabilities well, right? We don't serve disabled folks well because we don't see disabilities that are before us, and we don't inquire in ways that are appropriate. I mean, you don't go, "Hi, do you have a disability?" But that we don't actually frame it, so we don't meet needs. So Dawn's example, right? Or sometimes you're working with a client and not removing the barriers between the solicitor-client relationship is ultimately going to deeply impact the client, and it will impact service, and it will impact outcomes. So there's that, lay that to the side, although maybe we shouldn't, but put that to the side for a moment. And then the other piece is that, we know, and I talk about this a lot at the law school, we talk about equity. We're talking about making sure that everybody is seen and is able to be well and is enabled to succeed in the environment. I'm not giving you the actual definition I use, but and really that's based on outcomes. And the outcomes are, do disabled lawyers stay in the profession? Where are they? Right? What are they doing? And how well are they doing? And the reality is that the stigma around disability is so significant in the profession that lawyers with disabilities are plentiful. And oftentimes we don't know who those folks are, and they're not okay. And we're not okay, right? We're just not. And so so when we talk about that, that's the outcome, right? And that's what we have to go back and undo. So now let's go back to, legal education. Some of the ways that our environment is ableist, I'll give you a great example. The essay, like we just conducted, the University of Manitoba has conducted an accessibility survey. We have some qualitative data that we can sort of talk about a little bit. But one of the things that we know is that going into any classroom at all, we have students with disabilities, whether they're diagnosed or not diagnosed. Right? We do. We know we do. It's not possible that we don't.
Right.
We have an accommodation team for our Juris Doctor program. The accommodation team involves our SAS coordinator over at Student Accessibility Services. She's amazing. And then me and the associate dean and sometimes the academic advisor. That's the academic advisor. That's our JD accommodation team. We've never had an accommodation team for graduate students in our faculty.
Wow.
Okay? We've never had an accommodation team because no one has asked for accommodations in the grad program ever in institutional memory that we can recall. And so we're trying to sort of disrupt that a little bit. And that's not really the part of the question, but part of what we're doing is working directly with grad students, make sure they understand that and start busting the stigma and busting the shame and talking about it.
Yes.
So when we go into an average classroom, the average classroom is teaching law with that invisible neutral center that we never talk about and we never see. We just see that which is compared and othered against it. And one of them is ability, right? Like the reasonable person initially was the reasonable man on the Clapman omnibus. Well, guess what? You don't step on a bus if you don't have disabilities. Right? Like, if you have to, like, right, you're not like from a physical disability standpoint, right? Right. So what is that? That's, that's a core neutrality that is invisible. And we don't see how ableistic we are in the profession. And a lot of it is not understanding how people come to have certain diagnoses, particularly around neurodivergence. All of a sudden, quote unquote, everybody's autistic. No, not all of a sudden anyone's autistic. We're recognizing people's autism, right? Finally, we're recognizing and diagnoses are actually happening that, aren't, right? And the way that we see autism spectrum, folks on the autism spectrum are very different. We're starting to learn about that. This is we're learning, that with ADHD, 60% of women, at least in the US, are not diagnosed with ADHD until adulthood. Many are not diagnosed until they're far into their careers. So you've got folks who are undiagnosed and they're practicing and they're struggling and there's shame because you can't do it the way everyone expects you to do it. And you have to, and you don't necessarily know what's going on. So when we talk about that from an educational standpoint, part of the problem is that we have to educate everybody within the faculty, including other students, about what that experience might be like, and to be open to the fact that those experiences are all going to be very variable, that those barriers exist and will be reinforced and impacted by race and gender and sexuality and gender identity, and we know that too. And then what we do is we just sort of teach this ableism, we teach this default of normality in this othering way, and we carry it with us. We teach it in our curriculum often, right? We're teaching in our curriculum, but the methods we use to teach, the way that we view students with disability who require accommodations, right? The stigma is significant. And the perception often is that disabilities are just like, you got your family doctor to write you a letter and you got accommodations and it's like, asking for candy and you just got it, right? And that's not the case at all. And so what we really have to do is educate around, what a barrier is in a classroom, right? So, and how do you alleviate that barrier? If a student needs an alternative format for materials that are being presented on a screen, we have to give that to those students in advance. Why? Because they need to be able to use adaptive technology so that they can access the content, just like everybody else in the classroom can access the content who doesn't have that particular, who isn't experiencing that particular barrier, right?
Right.
And we're not doing that yet.
Okay.
We're doing it. I shouldn't say that. That's not true. We are working on that and we are doing it, but we've got a long way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is just also busting the invisibility of this. So,
Right.
When I was in private practice, I never, ever admitted that I had disabilities, ever. I just didn't. I've always worked full time. I've always been fully productive. A lot of the time, I didn't see my disabilities as disabilities myself. I'd internalized the ableism, right? And I wasn't seeing that a lot of what I was experiencing was actually me, the me I am interacting with barriers. But, and so that's part of what we have to do is bust the invisibility, and not just in this student has these accommodations and that student has those accommodations, but to talk about our disabilities.
Right. Yeah.
2 weeks ago, I was preparing for the practice of law, PPL,
Mm-hmm.
Natasha's class. And, I talked about very openly, look, I'm neurodivergent.
Right.
I have ADHD.
Mhm.
I have autistic traits.
Mhm.
My brain skips. I lose my train of thought. That's happened several times as I've been speaking already today. And it takes enormous effort to get my brain back to what I wanted to say in the first place. So if I seem like I'm meandering, that's why.
Yeah.
I talked, and it was late in the day, and I said, and my meds have worn off. So
Yeah.
the brain's probably going to skip, and I'm probably going to ask you what I just said, and you're going to have to tell me.
Yeah.
Just doing that,
Communicate.
helps to break down the erasure of disabilities, right? And sure enough, after that class was over, two students who are neurodivergent came up and said, we don't know how we're going to transition to the profession. We don't know when to talk about this. We don't know when to tell people. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to get ready. And so that spurred a conversation between myself and the director of professional development and our career service person. We need to do a bit of a workshop for students with disabilities transitioning into the profession. And what can you do to shore yourself up? And how might you approach these issues once you get to the firms? Because when you get to the firms, it's not going to be any different than it is at the law school.
Right. Yeah. No, Laurel, thank you so much. I think that was amazing. No, you gave us so much insight there. You touched on things that I personally am going to continue expanding on. But just to grab more insight from Dr. Tess, I'll knock this question over to you as well to leave comment on, and we'll go through the rest of the panelists before we move on to the next question. So just a repeat, Doctor, how does the ableist structure of the legal profession and of law school create a downstream impact on how we serve our clients, and more specifically our disabled clients?
Yeah, for sure. Echoing Laurel's comments about law school in particular, I think cultural, I was going to call it cultural ableism or cultural saneism. Do you know what I mean? I think it manifests like in law school in the form of like inaccessible readings or high stakes timed exams that reward physical presence or stamina or conformity to professional scripts. I also think this also shows up in like articling processes, bar exams that prioritize a certain narrow range of capacities, right? I think this is because, traditionally legal ed has assumed a certain kind of student with a certain kind of body and brain. I think, like Laurel was saying, I think this is changing, and I see a lot of like amazing organizing, not just by students, but that value difference as a kind of insight. Rather than thinking about disability as a deficit, it becomes a kind of insight. For sure, this hasn't maybe translated all the way into legal practice, where demanding workloads or grind culture or valorizing overwork, definitely excludes certain kinds of bodies and brains. But these kinds of structures definitely teach future lawyers or new lawyers that disability is a personal problem, not a structural problem. And when we think that, the problem is that the lawyer-client relationship is going to reproduce those power imbalances rather than challenging them. And I think that this will come up particularly when it comes to capacity, lawyers unconsciously applying a best interest or like a capacity framework paternalistically.
Wow, thank you so much. Dawn, do you want to comment on that, please?
Well, I'll pick up on the stigma or fear that starts in law school. I call them hallway conversations. Repeatedly, I've been pulled aside by other individuals in the faculty, students in faculty who have, are disabled by a barrier, and they don't want to say anything about it because they've gotten the feeling it's going to plummet their career prospects, right? There's so much stigma and so much worry that we can't even talk about it in a classroom. I get pulled aside in a hallway where it's like no one around, right? Because it's such fear about being labeled disabled, right? Or what, that actually means. And this starts like, if you're already starting here and you're already fearful and you can't talk about it in law school, how can you talk about going into the working profession? Like, this is going to just extend on, right? And if we can't talk about it in law school, how are we going to talk to our clients who we think might be facing a barrier, right? If you're only used to communicating with somebody in this one way and you're too fearful, or you have this ableist perspective that everybody who comes into your office is going to communicate and do things the same way, it's really detrimental, right? Like, I've already been kind of like working and trying to figure out, because of my ADHD, where am I going to fit when it comes to articling, right? Because I have a certain workflow that just might not fit with other places, right? But it's a lot more of a process that really I started like a year ago, 2 years ago, thinking out these things and starting to shore myself up. Right? So it starts early and it's just progressive. Like, even when I talk to other lawyers about how they feel about their disability, literally we go down to a coffee shop that's really far away from the firm, because if we talk about anything there, heaven forbid anybody hears or even gets a sense about what we're talking about, And speaking about communications, I'm going to do a little plug here. I am holding an accessibility conference in February called Breaking Barriers, Advancing Accessibility Law. We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of ranges of accessibility topics, from legislation to how it actually plays out in the legal structure. So
thank you so much for that little plug, Dawn. We're really looking forward to joining you at that conference. Hopefully the audience can register and mark that date down in the calendar. Peter, can I look to you for a comment on this ableist structure and the downstream impacts has on our clients, but more specifically on the disabled clients?
Well, it's one of the things that we could have a lot of discussion about. We won't, but it comes up as intersectionality. So many of our clients are not only may have a disability, but they may also be racialized or of the LGBT community or whatever. And all of those things impact on how we interact with that client and with that profession. And as somebody that works in the profession with a disability, I think the profession itself still just reinforces you're supposed to be in front of me, you're supposed to speak English, you're supposed to be of the majority race, and not too long ago you're supposed to be male, right? So we still got a long way to go in sort of, when we talk about, yes, let's support our students that are getting ready to go out into the profession, let's also do some work with the profession to say, people with disabilities should not be unexpected, not only as clients, but as your colleagues. Okay. And it's, to be fair to law, it's not just law. I do a lot of work in the entertainment industry, and a lot of entertainment venues, for example, do a pretty decent job of providing an accessible space for someone who's come to watch a show. Most venues haven't figured out yet that their performers probably have disabilities and they need access to the stage and to the green room and the blah blah blah. So it's not just the law, but the law, because our access to society is so based around the law, I think our profession has a larger impact in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that comment. Very good comparisons to draw on there. Darren, can you please comment on this before we jump on to our next question?
For sure, Janelle. One of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that for many persons with disabilities, and at the same time, maybe not for many, getting to work every day and just making it through the day is actually challenging. It takes a lot more energy. And so I think we need to remember that when we're dealing with our clients. We need to give them the grace to be tired, to give them the grace to not quite get back to us on our own schedule. Maybe we need to prepare that, plan for that. One of the things that I've learned over the years is about expecting people with disability to be able to advocate for themselves, that many times they can't actually. And so it's on us then as the profession to take on that obligation, not as if we know the answers, because we don't, as we've talked a fair bit about today, but to be able to find out what the answers are and then present them and engage with our clients when they're able to ultimately. And I'm not sure that that's unique necessarily to persons with disabilities. A lot of us are exhausted at the end of the day, but I think it happens more frequently for many persons with disabilities, whether it's dealing with the lights that you didn't have your glasses for, in my case, my blood sugar just didn't act the way it was supposed to today. And now, I've had to spend time or be distracted. And so anyway, it's not unique to persons with disabilities, but I think it's quite common.
Thank you so much for that comment. I'm really getting a sense of empathy needs to be afforded, and more so than not. So that just takes us right into our next question. What structures and/or processes can we put into place? And Darren, actually, if you could lead us off on this one, that would be great. But can we put into place within our workplaces, law offices to support accessibility accommodations, whether that be of employees or clients? What are our duties to accommodate?
Okay, so I'm going to mention 3 pieces of legislation because it's it's Access to Justice Week, and we're lawyers, most of us. So you should know about the Accessibility for Manitobans Act, CCSM Chapter A 1.7, the Human Rights Code, CCSM H 175, and the Accessible Customer Service Standard Regulation, so MR 171/2015. I also want to touch on a definition of accommodation, and I think Dawn started us off with this too, but the duty to accommodate is a legal obligation to make adjustments to policies, practices, or physical spaces to enable individuals with disabilities or other protected characteristics to participate fully in the workplace. I'm not going to talk about what all of that means necessarily. Rather, I want to focus the next few minutes of my comments on what can we do, because it's great to know what the law is, but actually, what do you do? Like, how do you make this happen for the people around you, for yourself? So I think the objective is to aim for an inclusive workplace. Avoid a workplace that only has stairs. Sounds really simple, but that's fine because I work for government. But if you're a sole practitioner and you're trying to find a place, that's obviously a complication. But try to avoid it. Be conscious about it. To the extent that you have policies or practices in your workplace, develop them ones that aim to avoid the need for many accommodations. Think about it in advance. And I'll say technology is a real boon here. Voice to text and text to voice can assist people with vision limitations, for example. Alternative text formats can be of assistance there as well. Pause here and say, imagine the freedom of driverless cars for people with vision, hearing, and movement limitations. Doesn't matter. You can drive. The car's there and it drives itself. And so those are sort of physical limitations, let me say. But there's also, the ability to work remotely, which can assist if you've got childcare responsibilities. You can get out of the office, get the child out of daycare, stay home with a sick kid, and still actually contribute. And So technology is our friend here. Not always, to be very clear, right? Nothing's perfect, but you have to master it. Or you have to think about it. So consider accessibility when making decisions about the workplace. Make sure the hallways are clear of boxes, always, that you've got to practice, that you don't start piling by filing or filing by piling. Make sure they're sufficiently wide so people in a wheelchair can go down the hallway and through the doors. That will help you avoid a really expensive renovation when you hire someone who is in a wheelchair. It'll also help you, or if you get retained by somebody who has that need, you can actually meet, have your client into the workspace. Do you have a space that could be a prayer room? How do you handle a request for a day off to participate in a culturally significant event or religious practice? Those are things that you need to think about. Now, those latter are not specifically disabilities, but they're protected characteristics, and that's one of the things that we have to accommodate. So now, once you've set up your office to allow people to actually get into it and to get to you, what then? Are you done? Well, I'd say let's go back to our objective. It's to enable people to participate fully in the workplace. How do you do that? So generically, you have to create a space where people are willing to trust you. And that's difficult. But let me say it can be especially difficult in this space. Because, and especially for people who have invisible disabilities or issues. Because many of us have a lifetime of experience that teaches us to keep those things hidden. Now, it could be as simple as they don't want to be Darren the diabetic kid, or they don't want you to treat them any differently, even if it's positively. I don't want people to be watching what I'm eating and thinking about it. I don't even want to think that they're watching what I'm eating and thinking about it. Or that I might have to explain to them, because I don't want to have to explain to them that piece of cake that I ate, which you think probably isn't on the diabetic diet, is something that I've already calculated for. Right? I don't want to think that my colleagues are doing that. So yeah, I don't want to be Darren the diabetic kid. Or equally likely, and in fact more likely, it could be that they've had negative reactions in the past. And they just don't want to take the risk that they're going to have another one. Could be a combination of those factors. But also, once I tell you, I can't untell you. And if you're not someone who demonstrates openness to this, I'm probably going to avoid the risk. Another factor in our ableist profession is that I don't want you to think that I got what I've accomplished based on my disability. Right? As Laurel commented about how we have bring that into ourselves. Everything I've got, I earned. It's not, nobody gave it to me. And so again, how do you do this? Well, if I said there was a magic sentence that would make it all easy, you just have to say these 3 words. Would you believe me? What about just a simple policy? Just one policy. You just need to adopt this and everything will be fine. I certainly hope you wouldn't believe me. I maybe make a fortune on YouTube or something, or TikTok, but yeah, there's nothing simple about this. Persons with disabilities or other protected characteristics, it's a really broad group of people. Let me ask you, what do you think that I and the other members on this panel share in common? Not much that you can see anyway. So how do you find out? Well, you have to talk to us. You have to talk to us individually. And sometimes, in that cafeteria or in the hallway, as Dawn talked about, not in front of the whole class, where you're saying, are you supposed to eat that cupcake? Go back to my,
Oh no, I hope nobody says that to you.
Well, they don't anymore.
Okay, good. Yeah, they need to stop that.
But so you need to talk to us, and it's a significant step. You need to treat us as an individual, not as a group. Don't generalize. And the second step is to start early. So if you're hiring, start your advertisement for the position that you're open to accommodation. If you don't advertise, mention it at the interview. You're open to accommodation.
Mhm.
They're thinking about the hiring process, obviously. And if so, ask if someone needs accommodation. They probably won't tell you actually. But what you're communicating is openness, even if they don't tell you.
Mm.
And I just want to make a note here that finding talented employees is extraordinarily difficult. You all know that. And so don't shrink the pool by excluding some of the best. If somebody's made it through law school, that we think that they're really smart. If they've made it through law school with a disability, they've demonstrated something even more. And that is a value you want, right? That's somebody who's really worked hard. For clients, ask them if you need them to write out your advice. I was struck by Don's comment earlier about how the lawyer refused. Like, what? How would you refuse a request from your client? Well, again, I work in the public sector. Maybe I'm missing things, but ask them if they need something, right? Do they need it written out? Do they need notes? Even if it's just bullet points to help them remember. Like, it's such a simple thing. Get a legal assistant to assist you, or AI will do all this stuff for us now. The other thing I want to say is, if you're not comfortable with the accommodation that was requested, do that, and then work with the person to brainstorm another one. So back to Don's case, don't refuse. Just say, look, I don't want to write you a whole letter. It's going to cost 100, or however many hundreds of thousands of dollars. How about if I just give you some quick notes? We'll both, you'll get what you need, and I won't have to charge you for an hour's worth of time for just recording it. I think my last point is on to consider how you create openings for people to identify issues. You need to communicate that you're open to them raising it, and when they raise it, you must engage. Recognize the power that you hold. You don't need the diagnosis. You just need to know what's getting in the way of them being successful. That's all you want to know. They may well share their diagnosis. My experience is, when you get to this point with people, they're really willing to share because they trust you. Work with the person to identify ways to do whatever needs to be done. Acknowledge their expertise in the area. They have a lifetime of experience dealing with this, but they may not have ever done it in the context in which you're dealing with them, whether say they're new to the workplace. Be open to experimentation. Make a plan to revisit it so that you can make changes, and your role is to support them. It's not to do it for them. So start early, make an active offer, think about it before you get a request, experiment, recognize your power, and recognize their expertise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Darren. Dawn, I'll just pass it to you to make comment on if that's good with you.
Yeah. So my experience has been with this is I've had accommodations in the workplace, particularly I need to move a lot. Right. So an accommodation is, I can move and walk as I need, I still get my work done, but I've had other people look at me and be like, she must not be doing her work. She's really lazy. Right. Because she gets to leave her desk all the time. And instead of coming and asking me, why do you move away from your desk so much? Right. After, took them all to ask me when they got it. It's not that I'm not doing my work. It's my brain works when I'm moving. Right. And to Darren's point, he's talking about a lot of big accommodations. Once again, I talk about size of scale. He's talking about making sure you have a place that you don't have to renovate. Right. A lot of accommodations that you might need to offer, or see with a colleague can be small. Right. They might need to move lots to get more movement breaks. They might wear sunglasses because the light hurts, right? They might have a different type of pen, right? Or their screen might look like a little darker because they use an e-reader or a different thing. So when we're talking about accommodating in the workplace or creating that space, it's not necessarily always a huge, big thing, right? Sometimes it's these little things that, other people just see as odd or weird, right? Until they talk to you about it, right? They're like, why does that person get to wear sunglasses? Why does this person and it's almost like we've talked about inclusion, but it's almost that othering, right? you know, and stuff, and opening that space to be inclusive. It's like, you don't belong because, right? But once they understood, it's, I work when I walk, right? I've always made my meetings. Work has always gotten done. I've always been where I needed to be when I'm there. You know, it was fine. But it's that initial, like, why are things so different, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Don. Peter, do you want to comment, please?
Yeah, I'd like to start by picking up on a couple of things that Darren said. And it was the idea of the active offer, right? If you're putting out a job offer, say right in the job offer, if you need assistance in making this application, please contact us at. Again, someone might be reluctant to take you up on that, but at least you sent the message that you're open to being inclusive and trying to include people. And it's again, that kind of engagement when you're a lawyer and you have clients. If you get the sense that somebody would be assisted by providing them with notes, make the active offer, right? Make it part of your practice to do those little extras when you can. The word will get out very quickly that you do those kinds of things, and hopefully that'll do your practice and whatever good. That's not why you're doing it, but there's that added bonus, right? If you do that. And the other thing, this question started with what can we do? Well, I'm an accessibility audit guy, and I'm going to say to the people that are here listening, good for you. If you're here listening to this, you're already aware of accessibility and inclusion, and that's good. If you haven't done it, either do or have somebody do an accessibility audit of your workplace, and not just the physical place. We're talking about your hiring practices, your website, all of those things, and then publish the results on your website. So then your clients or your potential clients know what they're up against. Sure, maybe you have, at the current time, you have stairs at the front of your law firm, but if you're open to meeting people virtually or in the space that works for them, let them know that as part of your accessibility assessment. If you don't let them know that, they're moving on to the next firm or on to the next lawyer. So that's something that organizations can do very actively. It will and it will put you in compliance with the provincial legislation, which is the concern of most firms in this province. And the other thing that Darren mentioned that I think is important is this idea of a feedback process. I do a lot of work with federal institutions, and as part of the federal accessibility legislation, you're actually required to have a feedback process as part of your whatever. So if I'm working with a museum, for example, they will they have on their website an opportunity that if you have an accessibility concern, you can record it. It's been recorded, it's tracked and dealt with, right? And that's actually part of the legal process for federal institutions.
Thank you for that, Peter. I just noted, I failed to mention this earlier, my apologies. Participants, just a reminder to click interpretation at the bottom right of your screen if you wish to see the ASL translation. Okay. Dr. Tess, did you just want to comment on that before we move on to the next question that you'll kick us off on?
Yeah, I can just say really quickly, and as a way to sort of segue to the next question, is that you know, we've already talked about how saneism and ableism is baked into the way that we do things. It's baked into like how we do our job, is how we interpret the law, how we represent our clients. And I think one of the most powerful ways that saneism and ableism operates is invisibly, right? It's hard to kind of get a hold of it. Do you know what I mean? So it's really important, like Peter was saying, to get support. These are really big questions. Get support. Asking for help is a really great lawyerly skill. And these are also like countercultural things that we're doing here, right? The legal field has traditionally focused on individual accommodation that's granted retroactively, seeing clients with disabilities as vulnerable or incapable, whereas social model, and other kinds of models pushes us to think instead about how inaccessible legal systems produce barriers, produce disability, and require us to instead to think about anticipating needs from the outset. I think it also requires us to reframe ethics and access to justice, and how lawyers have a duty not just to comply with, like Darren was saying, the code, but also and accessibility laws, but also to do something more, to be more actively dismantle disabling systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that comment on that question there.
Yeah.
Just moving on to the next question that you'll lead us off on, and I might only take one, maybe two comments from the panel after, because we have questions waiting in queue here. Dr. Tess, what are the next steps in terms of making the legal profession and the provision of legal services more accessible?
Yeah, so the last question, right? Well, we've talked about awareness and the embeddedness, the baked-inness of saneism and ableism.
Yeah.
What next, right? Like, how do we move from awareness to transformation? I think number one, just like we've done here, is by naming ableism and saneism as structural, in its multiple forms, right? And that it's embedded in norms of productivity, objectivity, decorum, professionalism, right? So that we can start even the project of imagining a different way of doing things, a different kind of profession. I think, Darren, you already talked about this, like thinking about building accessibility into like all the different stages, right? Not just office layout, but also thinking about communication, billing practices, so on. So replacing competitive sink or swim cultures with mentorship, some way of doing things that normalizes, I'm air quotes, normalizing flexibility, moving beyond just mere compliance towards solidarity with disabled communities, towards collective liberation, where disabled people are like, have a real seat at a real table. One opportunity that, people get excited about is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN Convention. Article 13 requires that states parties, people who signed on to the convention, ensure that disabled people have equal access to justice. And also Article 29, have access to participation fully and effectively in public life. And according to Professor Archie Kaiser from Dalhousie, these protections have totally transformed our professional responsibility. It requires us to think about disabled people not just as clients, but lawyers, leaders, decision-making, embedding accessibility and inclusion into everything we do. And I think embedding these kinds of disability justice frameworks kind of makes sense in law schools. Like universities can be, not always, a key site of transformation. So accessibility and legal ed requires us to think bigger and center disabled voices in curriculum design, teaching, and mentorship. And then finally, I think it's also important when we are starting to imagine what we can do differently, that we come together like we are here today, right? Organizing collectively. And I'll just make a plug here for the Canadian Association of Lawyers with Disabilities. They are an organization of disabled lawyers. I'll put the link in the chat, but really built on this idea of peer support, advocacy, public education, and drawing on, the Supreme Court, its statement in the Trinity Western case, that a more diverse profession is a more competent profession.
Great. That got me really excited. I just did a tour to some high school students this morning, and I was emphasizing our push to diversify the profession. So you just really sang my same tune there. Thank you so much. Dr. Laurel, sorry. Can you please comment on this?
Absolutely. So again, building on everything that Tess said, which is absolutely what we need to do conceptually and in action, but like, how do you actually do that? And the way you actually start doing that is to recognize that you're never going to stop pursuing a greater accessibility. Like that's step one. Step two is embed a policy. And yes, you have to have a policy, but do you have to have a policy that only complies with legislation? Or do you have to have or can you imagine a policy that holds each other accountable within the organization for doing the work of becoming more accessible, that recognizes what needs to happen and makes sure that it happens? So piece one, you need a policy. Like, should you, like, you have to have one anyway. So
Yeah.
why not take a step further and
Yeah.
actually make that an accessible, truly equitable, welcoming environment for anybody who's working in that organization and for the people that are being invited in. The second piece is, become familiar enough and educated enough with how some folks' disabilities might present that it tweaks to you. I once worked with an organization where there was someone who very obviously was very intelligent, but over and over and over could not grasp certain mathematical calculations. Nobody in the organization went, does this person have a learning disability maybe? Not one. And in that case, the person was both racialized and disabled. And when we talk about that stigma, I haven't been into a single organization where I have done surveys where disproportionately the people who have not said that they have disabilities are racialized and queer, right? So the stigma is so significant that we're not asking for accommodations depending on what else is going on with our identities, right?
Right.
So let's bake that in. And I had, like, when we were talking Tess and I was listening to everybody, I was like marking a couple of important things down. Like, so that's one. The other is, even as you're engaging with a client or you're engaging with someone else, you can ask questions that signal your willingness to be accommodating without being weird. You can ask people to say, for example, how do you retain and understand information best? Your first client meeting, how do you
Language.
retain and understand information best?
Yeah.
Right? What does that look like?
Yeah.
And then tailor it to whatever that person says, like to the answer. And as Darren said, like some solutions might be, expensive on a billable hour model. You try to find something else, but you basically like hear it and figure it out. Another question: in what format do you prefer to receive information? Do you prefer to receive emails? Do you prefer to receive documents in Word? Do you prefer to receive documents in PDFs? How do you want to get it? Those are basic open questions that if you just make that part of when talking about processes, if you just make that part of every single time you sit down with a client, you're signaling.
Right.
And maybe people will say something, maybe they won't, maybe they know they have disabilities, maybe they don't, right? Or they don't see their particular condition as a disability. So those are the ways to do that. And the other is, as an employer, bring in an occupational therapist. If you've got someone with disabilities who it does actually say, this is my disability, this is what I need, offer to bring in the OT, because the OT may very well be able to assess the environment and suggest other accommodations that the person themselves hadn't thought of. Of course, if the person says, no, I don't need that, please respect what the person is saying. But, there's lots of ways where you can just be mindful and not wait for someone to say, I have a disability, I require an accommodation, and just be like, what do you need? To everybody.
100%. Yeah, no, and that really takes me back to what Peter mentioned earlier about the audit. Like, I just think that's so great. Speaking of Peter, would you like to comment on this?
I can, and what we've done at this point in the discussion on this topic is sort of say the steps that we can take to go along that. Let's be inclusive path, if I could call it that. I want to put a goalpost at the other end and say, what are we trying to get to here? And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, within our law firms, within our organizations, within our profession, we want to create a culture of inclusion where it becomes part of what we do every day. As Lauren said, just as part of your practice, you have inclusive steps, but as we're picking work locations, or we're designing conferences or whatever, we just assume people with all kinds of disabilities are going to be there, and we're thinking about it as we're doing it. And the other thing that research has shown us is, if we do, whether it's building a new building or organizing a conference, if we do all of that planning as part of what we do and up front, it adds very little to the time and the effort. And I know with some organizations that I've worked with where we've helped them with process change, we've actually gone back and surveyed later and said, did we create this horrible burden for you by changing your processes and making you more accessible? And universally, they said, no, once it became part of the practice that we do, it's just another step in the process.
Right, right.
Or steps in the process.
Thank you for that. Darren, any final words before we move on to questions?
You know, I would just say one more thing, which is don't be afraid to make a mistake. How to learn. And if you're doing the things we've talked about, asking the questions Laurel talked about, if your client looks at you like you're crazy, oh well, you know, it's okay. It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to ask, offer a hand only to have it turned away. That's totally fine.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dawn, I'll get you to close out the questions before we go to Q&A, please. Just final comments on that.
What was the question again? Sorry.
Oh, what are the next steps in terms of making the legal profession and the provision of legal services more accessible? Just a quick little comment. We'll move on to questions here.
I think just openness. You know, most people with disabilities don't mind talking about them. If they do, they'll let you know. Just openness, because honestly, I think we have to stop having hallway conversations. It needs to be something that's normalized, right?
Right. Thank you so much for that, Dawn. Okay, guys, I appreciate your comments and all the questions. We're coming close to closing time, so we're going to move on to Q&A from our participants here. I'll just take it from the top. As a community member who supports folks through legal services, what is the best way to advocate for more understanding, especially with those hidden or unseen disability folks might be experiencing? Anybody want to?
I think my advice would be just model the behavior.
Model the behavior.
Get involved in organizations like we've heard a couple about CLAD, we've heard about other organizations, but I think modeling the behavior is the best thing that we can do.
Great. Anybody else want to make a comment before we?
Yeah, I would say before, like, you need to model the behavior, but also, like, again, re-emphasizing, learn, like, go out and do some reading about what is neurodivergence, what is, you know, what are different disabilities and what might folks need. You know, if you have, you know, and sometimes you're going to do that specific because there's an encounter you have, and sometimes you're going to do it for general interest. But if you have a client or you have a colleague with MS, don't you want to know what a person with MS might experience? And then build it from there? Like, don't you want to know what that might be like? And so those are the kinds of things that I think that we just, you know, we can't advocate until we know. And I can tell you, even in the 1 year that I've been here in this role, what I've learned has been tremendous, and it has revealed to me how much more I need to learn. But, you know, we can take that in chunks and, you know, and learn. You know, you don't understand how depression might affect somebody's cognition. Go read about how depression might affect somebody's cognition and learn about it, right? We have a good internet sometimes for a reason, sometimes. So that would be my answer to that.
Thanks, Laurel.
I would say collect resources, right? When you're advocating, the more resources you have and the more places you look for information, is what Laurel's talking is great. But in Manitoba, there's also the Manitoba's Accessibility Compliance Secretariat, or the Manitoba's Office for Persons with Disabilities, what I think they're called. Oh, Manitoba's Accessibility Office is what they're called now. They're a great source of resource. So if we need to advocate, the Accessibility Compliance Secretary has a complaints framework, right? You can ask them, what you're entitled to, right? They kind of help you walk you through the Manitoba's Accessible Manitoban, AMA, the Accessible Manitobans Act. There we go. So yeah, kind of just do a little research and become aware, so you have those resources if you need.
Thanks, Dawn. Thank you so much. Just in light of time, we had 3 panelists comment on that question. I'm going to move on. We've got some broader or big questions here. Sorry. This one is from Paulo Arruda. I have 2 questions related to internationally trained lawyers, ITLs, and their role in providing accessible legal service. Question for Laurel Harris. The path for internationally trained lawyers to practice in Canada can be very challenging. What is the biggest systemic hurdle you are seeing in integrating ITLs into the Manitoba legal market? And what specific steps is the new Robson Hall program taking to address it? What's your view on ITLs being aware and prepared to provide accessible legal services? Oh, you're muted, my friend.
I thought I had unmuted myself.
There we go.
Okay. The first question I'm not going to get into in depth because it's not really truly about this topic. And so I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of information. However, what I would say is the same issues which affect accessibility in our profession, also delve into the other forms of oppression and other isms, right? And so at the end of the day, what surrounds all of these in the profession are what we call deficit frameworks. We see disabled people as being inferior to able-bodied, quote unquote, people. Whether we acknowledge that out of our mouths or not, that's a different story. But the frameworks that we function from are that persons who have disabilities are automatically somehow deficient. Internationally trained lawyers are somehow deficient. So what does that mean for accessibility with internationally trained lawyers moving into the profession? We know, and part of what we do with legal education here and what we're working on is making sure that all of our students, whether they're internationally trained lawyers or in the JD program, understand some of this, the basic theory behind this and some of the practicality behind this before we send them out into the world. And, internationally trained lawyers, have intersecting identities just like the rest of us, some of which create unique barriers. And undoubtedly, there are internationally trained lawyers with disabilities moving into the profession. What we do here, and in terms of being aware and being able and prepared to provide accessible legal services, we do the same thing here that we do with internationally trained lawyers that we do with everyone else, because folks are embedded into our JD classes. And so the conversation is growing. It's not as big as it ought to be, but it's there, and it has more than commenced, is to just educate people in general on accessibility. Internationally trained lawyers need the same information that everybody else does. They're not special.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that answer, Laurel. Next question is, do you have suggestions for introducing change in a workplace culture that is really set in the way things are supposed to be and not supportive of difference? And perhaps I will get Peter to respond to this one first, and then somebody can jump in after.
Oh yeah, thank you for giving me the easy one.
I didn't do it on purpose, I promise.
Basically, I'll say this is start the conversation. We have to talk about in our organization how we have clients that have disabilities, whether we know it or not. We have colleagues that have disabilities that know it or not, and start to have those conversations in their organization. As we can put a face to inclusion, it becomes a less scary thing or a less onerous thing. I think for organizations that haven't done any of this work before, that there's this perception that it's going to be really difficult and really expensive. And why should we bother to do it? Because we've done fine to this point so far. So I think you have to start with the conversations. And I mean, I know often in organizations that I worked with, I mean, I was a pretty visible person with a disability. So often the conversations came to me, and I was able to bring those forward about, you know, how our organization can do differently or typically better.
Thank you so much, Peter. Dr. Tess, can I just get you to comment on that question before we move on to the next?
You know, I would just say that law and lawyers aren't often prized for asking for help. Like, you know, asking for help, asking good questions is a really good lawyerly skill. But like I said earlier, countercultural. Ask for help.
Yeah.
Mm.
Great. Thank you. Dawn, do you want to make a comment before we move on to the next question?
You know what? I think just bring up the conversation, like Peter was saying, as a person with an invisible disability, it's sometimes very awkward to bring up that conversation, and you can see it in the eyes of others. Okay. They're like, we don't get it, right? So sometimes it's just opening those conversations gently and being up and honest. Like, you know what? I have to work here. I need to move, right? Like, I need to wear my sunglasses. Like, this is why. It's not because I'm cool or whatever. It's just so, but you know, just open it and be prepared for people to be caught off guard. When you have an invisible disability, people get caught off guard and they're like, what?
Thank you so much, Dawn. Okay, final question. And this question is directed towards Darren. Can a visible skin condition or the effects of body shaming, especially when it causes someone to withdraw socially or avoid public spaces, be considered a disability if it impacts their mental and emotional well-being? What are the ways of A2J for such people?
Peter, you didn't get the hard question. So in the context in which we're having our conversation today, I would say that, yeah, this sounds like a disability. If you want to know about some specific context, like can you claim the tax credit on your income tax form? Well, that's a very specific question, and of course, I can't give the legal advice because I work for the government and I can only give them legal advice. Now that I've dodged that part of the question, I do, you know what I think so yeah, in the context of the conversation we're having today, absolutely. If something about your life causes you to be socially withdrawn and you've got to now go to a workplace where there's 20 or 30 or maybe even hundreds of other people, obviously that's really challenging. You're not going to be in your comfort space for the 8 hours a day that you're in the office. And so if you need assistance in how to deal with that, you know, I'm trying to think about how when you say what are the ways to access to justice for these people. So if that's a problem that's being presented to someone, then yeah, seek out legal advice, quite frankly. Consult a group in the community. And again, we've heard about a few of them today, but the accessibility office, the government of Manitoba is there. You know, get advice about what you can or can't do. And if it's your employer scenario, if you work in a place where there's 100 people, ideally your employer will be willing to sit down and have the conversation with you that we've talked about here and that I sort of gave some tips for. And if you're worried about having that conversation, then you should talk to the advocates that you're going to talk to in advance about that as well. And recognizing that, so I believe the accessibility office will be there as a service free of charge. You want to go to a big law firm in True North Square, yeah, they're probably going to want some of your money. And so that may mean it's not possible for you, right? Or again, going out and getting the advice may be difficult.
Right.
I don't have easy answers, obviously, as I'm that I think you can hear.
It's not an easy subject after listening to everybody's comments. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all of our participants who joined us on this Zoom lunch hour, this 90-minute panel. And I want to just say a sincere thank you to all of our panelists You guys have enlightened my own personal journey, and I'm just really excited to take some of these comments back and implement them in my own life. So with that, I just want to remind all of the attendees that there are other Manitoba A2J Week events happening this week. So please tune into those, and I wish everybody well on their journeys. Take care. Thanks for joining.